For years, I believed that gratitude was the price of survival, that if someone paid for your future, they also owned your silence. From the outside, my family looked generous, supportive parents, a successful daughter, a proud graduation day waiting at the end of the road. But behind closed doors, every dollar had weight. Every check came with expectations that were never written down yet always enforced. I watched someone I loved slowly disappear under the pressure of being helped. I watched money turn into control, praise turn into leverage, and love turn into a transaction no one was allowed to question. And then came the ceremony. A public moment meant for celebration. A stage filled with smiles, cameras, applause. That was where everything finally broke open. Not with shouting, not with anger, but with truth spoken once clearly in front of everyone who thought they understood our story. Justice didn't come early, but when it arrived where no one could ignore it. Before we begin, I'm curious, where are you listening from? And what time is it there right now? Let me know in the comments. And if you've ever felt the weight of being quietly overlooked, consider subscribing. These stories are for those who kept standing even when no one was watching. I grew up learning how to be small without ever being asked to. It happened naturally, quietly, the way a house settles into its foundation over time. I was the older daughter, the responsible one, the child who didn't need reminders or rewards. My parents liked to say I was easy, as if that were a compliment, and not a description of how little space I took up in their lives. My sister Emily was different. She was bright in a way that drew attention, laughing louder, dreaming bigger, needing more reassurance. My parents called her our future, and they said it proudly, as if futures could only belong to one child at a time. At family dinners, they talked about her grades, her activities, her potential. When relatives asked about me, the answer was always brief: she's doing fine. And that was the end of it. The imbalance became undeniable the year Emily was accepted into a prestigious private university. The acceptance letter arrived in a thick envelope, and my mother cried when she opened it. My father framed the letter and hung it in the hallway right next to family photos. That night, they announced to everyone over a dinner that felt more like a press conference that they would be paying for Emily's entire college education. Tuition, housing, meal plans, everything. They said it like a victory speech. A full ride, my father corrected, someone smiling. Well, not a scholarship. We're covering it. The room filled with applause. Aunts and uncles praised their generosity. Cousins nodded in admiration. Someone joked that Emily was lucky to have parents who believed in her so much. I smiled too, because that's what was expected of me. I even hugged her, whispered congratulations, told her I was proud. And I meant it. I truly did. But no one asked how I had paid for my own education just a few years earlier. I worked 25 hours a week at a grocery store while carrying a full course load at a state university. I applied for every scholarship I qualified for and took out federal loans to cover what the scholarships didn't. I graduated with honors and a GPA I'd earned through exhaustion and discipline. My parents came to my graduation, of course. They clapped. They took photos. Then we went out to dinner, and that chapter quietly closed. There were no framed letters, no speeches, no public declarations of sacrifice. Back then, I told myself it didn't matter. I had always been independent. I didn't need the same kind of help. That was the story I repeated whenever the comparison crept in. It was easier than admitting that part of me wondered what it would feel like to be chosen so loudly. After the announcement, my parents began talking about Emily's college payments the way people talk about investments. They mentioned the tuition amount casually at first, then more frequently until it became a kind of family currency. That semester alone was almost $30,000, my father would say, shaking his head, not in regret but in emphasis. We're doing this because we believe in her. Whenever Emily disagreed with them about anything, her schedule, her friends, the city she wanted to live in, those numbers would quietly enter the conversation, not as threats, never directly, just reminders. After everything we're doing for you, my mother would say softly, we just want what's best. I noticed the way Emily's shoulders tensed when those words were spoken. I noticed how she started agreeing more quickly, apologizing more often. She stopped pushing back, stopped questioning. She learned, like I had, how to make herself smaller, but in a different way. At family gatherings, my parents were praised endlessly. You're such good parents, people told them. College is so expensive these days. Emily is so lucky. My parents accepted the compliments with practiced humility. They talked about sacrifice, about long hours, about how parents should do everything they can for their children. I sat there listening, wondering when help had turned into ownership. One evening, not long after Emily started her sophomore year, my mother called me into the kitchen. She was balancing the checkbook glasses perched low on her nose. "Do you know how much we've spent so far?" she asked, not looking up. I shook my head. She told me the number. It was more money than I had ever seen at once, more than my starting salary after graduation. She said it slowly, carefully, as if letting it sink into the air between us. "We're doing this for her future," she said. "She needs to understand that." I nodded because nodding was my reflex. But something about the way she said understand stayed with me. It wasn't about appreciation, it was about obligation. That night I replayed moments I had brushed aside before. The way my father corrected Emily's choices by reminding her who was paying. The way my mother expected daily phone calls, detailed explanations, constant reassurance. The way Emily's independence seemed to shrink the more my parents gave. I thought about my own path. The long hours, the quiet determination, the freedom that came with knowing no one could claim ownership over my decisions. I had resented that struggle once. Now I wasn't so sure. Emily never complained outright. She still smiled in public, still thanked our parents often. But when we were alone, there was a tightness in her voice I hadn't heard before. She asked me questions that seemed casual but weren't. Questions about contracts, about student rights, about whether money given by parents was ever truly unconditional. I answered what I could. Mostly I listened. What no one else seemed to notice was that Emily was changing, not rebelling, not breaking down, but paying attention. And for the first time, so was I. Because beneath all the praise and generosity, beneath the checks and applause, there was something unspoken forming. A realization that what looked like support from the outside could feel very different from the inside. And I had a growing sense that this story wasn't heading toward the ending everyone expected. The older I got, the clearer it became that my family had assigned us roles long before we understood we had a choice. Emily was the promise. I was the proof that promises didn't need applause to survive. My parents never said it outright, but everything about our lives reflected that division. When relatives talked about success, they pointed to Emily's tuition bills as if they were trophies. When they talked about responsibility, they looked at me. I was the example they used to reassure themselves that they had raised at least one child who didn't ask for much. At first, I wore that role with quiet pride. Independence sounded noble. Low maintenance sounded mature. I told myself I preferred earning things on my own. But preference and conditioning are difficult to tell apart when you've lived inside them long enough. My parents liked to recount stories about my college years as if they were anecdotes from someone else's life. "She worked so much back then," my mother would say, shaking her head. "I don't know how she managed." The tone was admiration mixed with distance, as though my endurance belonged to the past and no longer required acknowledgement. What they never mentioned was how many nights I came home exhausted, how many times I chose textbooks over meals, how often I told myself that needing help was a personal failure. Those details didn't fit the narrative. They complicated it. Meanwhile, Emily's experience was documented down to the last dollar. My father kept spreadsheets of her expenses updated monthly. Tuition, housing, books, fees. He didn't hide it. In fact, he seemed proud of the precision. "You should see how expensive education is now," he would tell anyone who listened. "We're setting her up for life." Emily nodded whenever he said that. Her smile never quite reached her eyes. I started to notice how often my parents spoke for her. At dinners, they answered questions directed at Emily before she could open her mouth. They explained her choices as if they had personally made them. "She's focusing on practical majors," my father would say. "No time for distractions." If Emily disagreed, it was brushed off as stress or immaturity. I remembered moments from my own past times I'd wanted to change direction but didn't feel entitled to ask for permission. I'd simply adjusted my plans around the limitations I already knew existed. Emily, on the other hand, was being shaped in real time, molded by expectations reinforced with money. One afternoon, while Emily was home on break, we sat on the back porch together. The air was quiet, heavy with late summer heat. She stared at her phone without scrolling, her fingers resting still against the screen. "Do you ever feel like you owe them something you can never repay?" she asked suddenly. The question wasn't dramatic. It was careful, almost rehearsed. I thought before answering. "I think they believe you do," I said. "That doesn't mean you actually do." She let out a breath that sounded like relief and exhaustion combined. "They keep saying they've sacrificed everything for me," she said. "Sometimes I don't even know what parts of my life are mine anymore." I didn't interrupt. I knew better than to rush her. They talk about my future like it's already decided, she continued. Where I'll work, where I'll live, who I should listen to. And every time I push back, even a little, it's like they pull out a receipt. That word stuck with me. Receipt. Proof of purchase. I told her about my own college years, not the sanitized version our parents like to repeat, but the truth. The nights I studied in break rooms, the panic of unexpected expenses, the relief of knowing that every decision, however hard, belonged to me alone. Emily listened closely, her expression tightening, as if each detail confirmed something she'd been afraid to admit. They never talk about that, she said quietly. About what you did. They don't need to, I replied. It doesn't fit their story. That conversation changed something between us. We started talking more honestly more often. She asked about loans, about contracts, about how universities handled tuition payments. At first I assumed she was just trying to understand the system, but the questions became more specific, more deliberate. Do parents usually make students sign anything, she asked one night. Not unless they're setting up a trust or a formal agreement, I said. Why? She shrugged. Just wondering. I didn't push. Whatever she was thinking through, it was clear she wasn't ready to say it out loud. My parents, meanwhile, became more confident in their authority. The more they spent, the more entitled they seemed to feel. They spoke openly about Emily's future plans as if they were group decisions. After graduation, she'll probably come back home for a year, my mother announced one evening. Emily looked up, startled. I was thinking of staying near campus, she said carefully. There are some entry-level positions. My father cut her off. We'll see, he said. Let's not forget who's been funding all of this. The room went quiet. I watched Emily's face harden just for a moment before she nodded and dropped the subject. That was the pattern: assertion, reminder, compliance. What unsettled me wasn't just how normalized it all was, but how invisible it seemed to everyone else. Friends praised my parents for being supportive. Extended family spoke about their generosity with admiration. No one questioned the cost beyond the financial one. I began to understand that injustice doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it wears the disguise of kindness. Sometimes it hides behind sacrifice and smiles and the unspoken rule that gratitude should never be conditional but often is. Emily started spending more time alone during breaks, poring over documents, making notes. She became quieter around our parents, more deliberate with her words. To them it probably looked like stress. To me it looked like preparation. I realized then that my role in this story was shifting too. I was no longer just the overlooked one, quietly observing from the sidelines. I was a witness, someone who could see the pattern clearly because I had lived its earlier version. And for the first time, I sensed that Emily wasn't trying to escape their control by force or confrontation. She was doing something far more dangerous to people like our parents. She was learning. By the time Emily entered her junior year, the atmosphere in our family had changed in ways that were subtle enough to ignore if you didn't live inside them. Conversations felt heavier. Silences lasted longer. My parents' generosity had become routine, almost invisible, but the expectations tied to it were sharper than ever. They no longer asked Emily what she wanted. They told her what made sense. My mother started every phone call the same way. I was thinking about your future, she'd say, as if that were a neutral statement. Then came the suggestions, internships they approved of, professors they liked, cities they believed were safe. Each suggestion was framed as guidance, but it carried the weight of a decision already made. Emily learned to respond carefully. She thanked them first, always gratitude before opinion. Then she'd soften her words, present her ideas as questions instead of plans. Even then, resistance was rarely tolerated. My father became more direct. He had always believed clarity was kindness. We're investing too much money for you to make emotional decisions, he told her once, without raising his voice. You'll understand when you're older. Emily was 21 at the time. What struck me was how often their language centered on ownership, not support, not help, investment, return, value. They spoke about her education the way business partners talked about a startup, and like any investors, they expected influence. I remembered how different it had been for me. Not easier, but simpler. I'd made choices knowing the consequences were mine alone. If I failed quietly. If I succeeded, it belonged to me. No one kept receipts. No one audited my ambition. Emily didn't have that freedom. Her life was under review. One night she called me past midnight. Her voice was steady, but there was a tightness underneath it. They want me to switch my concentration, she said. They think it's more marketable. Do you? I asked. No, she said without hesitation. But they're saying they didn't pay all this money for me to ignore reality. I could hear papers shuffling on her end. They keep bringing up the total cost, she continued. Every time I push back, it's like they're reminding me I belong to them. I chose my words carefully. Money doesn't give them legal authority over your choices, I said. Only emotional leverage. She was quiet for a moment. What if they made it legal, she asked. That question stopped me. What do you mean? I asked. They had me sign something freshman year, she said slowly. They said it was just for accounting purposes. Something about managing payments through a trust. I sat up in bed. Did you read it? I asked. I skimmed it, she admitted. I was 18. They said it was standard. I trusted them. Trust. The word felt heavy in my mouth. Do you still have a copy? I asked. Yes, she said. I've been looking at it again. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about control anymore. It was about boundaries that had been blurred deliberately, about authority that might have crossed into something formal without Emily fully understanding it. Over the next few months, my parents' behavior became increasingly confident, almost smug. They talked about Emily's future as if it were already settled. After graduation, she'll come back home, my mother told relatives. It makes sense. We've invested so much in her. Emily didn't contradict her in public. She never did. She smiled, nodded, played the role everyone expected. But in private, she was different, focused, quiet in a way that felt intentional. She asked me to help her review the documents she'd signed. We sat at my kitchen table one weekend, papers spread out between us. The language was dense, full of legal phrasing that made my head ache. But certain things stood out. Conditions, clauses, limitations tied to the funding. They framed it like protection, Emily said. Like they were helping me avoid debt. They were also protecting their control, I replied. She nodded. I think they assumed I'd never question it. That assumption, I realized, was the foundation of everything my parents had built. They believed authority was permanent if it was established early enough. They believed gratitude could be enforced. They believed silence meant agreement. Emily didn't confront them. Not then. She kept her grades high. She followed the rules publicly. But she stopped volunteering information. She stopped oversharing. She began documenting conversations, saving emails, keeping records. It wasn't rebellion, it was caution. My parents mistook her quiet for compliance. She's finally maturing, my father said once, understanding how the world works. I bit my tongue. As graduation approached, the pressure intensified. My parents talked obsessively about the ceremony, where they'd sit, who they'd invite, how proud they were. They hinted more than once that Emily should acknowledge their sacrifice publicly. It would mean a lot, my mother said. People should know how hard we worked for you. Emily agreed. Of course she did. She always agreed. But I noticed something else. She started asking questions about the ceremony itself. Who controlled the speaking order? Whether students were allowed to say anything beyond the script? What kind of oversight there was? She asked, as if she were simply curious, but I knew better. You're planning something, I said to her one afternoon. She looked at me, then away. I'm planning to be honest, she said. For once. I didn't ask more. Whatever she intended to do, it was clear she wasn't acting impulsively. This wasn't anger. It was resolve. Watching her, I felt a strange mix of pride and guilt. Pride that she had found her voice. Guilt that I hadn't questioned things sooner, that I had accepted my own role so easily. But maybe my silence had served a purpose too. Maybe observing had taught me what resistance needed to look like. The truth was, my parents believed the story ended the way they had written it. A grateful daughter. A public thank you. A return on investment measured in obedience. They had no idea that the very structure they used to control Emily had also given her something they never anticipated. Proof. The closer Emily got to graduation, the more my parents talked about money as if it were a living presence in the room. It hovered over every conversation, shaping tone and outcome before anyone even realized a disagreement had begun. What once sounded like generosity now carried an edge sharpened by repetition. My father stopped rounding the numbers. He recited exact figures down to the last dollar. By the end of this semester, he said, one night at dinner will be close to $240,000. That's not something you take lightly. No one responded. Emily stared at her plate. My mother nodded, satisfied. The implication was clear. Decisions now belonged to those who paid. They framed it as concern. They always did. We just want to make sure you don't waste opportunities, my mother said, her voice gentle, almost rehearsed. So many kids would kill for what you've been given. Given. The word was doing too much work. Emily had been offered an internship in a mid-sized city a few hours from campus. It wasn't glamorous, but it aligned with her interests. She was excited in the quiet way she'd learned, to be careful not to sound ungrateful, careful not to appear demanding. When she mentioned it at home, my parents exchanged a look that didn't need words. That's not where the real opportunities are, my father said. If we're being honest, my mother added, after everything we've invested, we expected you'd aim higher. Emily tried to explain. She talked about experience, mentorship, long-term growth. She spoke calmly, thoughtfully. It didn't matter. The decision had already been weighed against the receipts. We didn't pay all this money for you to take shortcuts, my father said. Shortcut, as if choosing her own path were a form of laziness. After that night, Emily stopped bringing up her plans in front of them. She waited until we were alone to talk things through. We met for coffee, took long walks, spoke in low voices like we were sharing secrets because we were. She showed me emails she'd saved, messages where expectations were implied but never stated outright. They never say it directly, she said once. But it's always there. The reminder that I owe them. They want you to feel indebted, I said. That's how control works when it doesn't want to look like control. She nodded. I used to think I was being dramatic, that I should just be grateful. That's what they're counting on, I replied. At home, my parents grew more insistent. They asked for updates constantly. Where Emily was applying, who she was speaking to, what her professors thought of her plans. If she didn't respond immediately, they followed up. If she sounded hesitant, they reminded her how much they'd done. Your father and I won't be around forever, my mother said during one call I overheard. We need to know you're making smart decisions while we can still guide you. Guide. Another carefully chosen word. What struck me most was how confident they were. They believed the moral high ground was unshakable. After all, who could argue with parents who had sacrificed so much? They assumed gratitude would outweigh autonomy. That Emily would eventually concede the way I always had. But Emily wasn't conceding. She was collecting. She asked me to help her organize everything: documents, emails, statements, timelines. We spent evenings sorting through folders, labeling files, piecing together a record of years' worth of conversations. She was methodical, patient. There was no anger in her movements, no urgency, just focus. They think this is about rebellion, she said once. It's not. It's about clarity. I watched her transform from someone constantly second-guessing herself into someone who trusted her own perception. The more evidence she gathered, the steadier she became. My parents noticed the change too, but misread it completely. She's finally understanding responsibility, my father said to me privately. You always did. Now she's catching up. I didn't correct him. As graduation approached, discussions about the ceremony intensified. My parents wanted it to be a celebration of their sacrifice as much as Emily's achievement. They talked about speeches, photos, acknowledgements. It would be nice if you mentioned us, my mother said to Emily. After all, none of this would have been possible without us. Emily smiled and agreed. Of course she did. But later she called me. They think the ceremony is the finish line, she said. For me, it's the beginning. I asked her if she was scared. Yes, she said honestly. But I'm more scared of what happens if I stay silent. That was something I understood deeply. Silence had protected me in some ways, but it had also taught my parents that compliance was permanent. Emily had learned the cost of that lesson early enough to question it. The week before graduation, my parents finalized their plans. They invited extended family, booked hotels, coordinated outfits. They talked about how proud they were, how much they'd given. They spoke as if the story were already complete. Emily, meanwhile, prepared quietly. She reviewed documents one last time. She spoke with people my parents didn't know about. She asked careful questions and received careful answers. She never raised her voice, never challenged them directly. Watching her, I realized something important. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it lets the other side believe they've already won. My parents believed that money had bought them the ending they wanted. They didn't consider that the same paper trail they used to remind Emily of her debt could also expose the limits of their authority. They were so focused on being acknowledged that they failed to notice what Emily had actually gained. Not defiance, Not anger. Understanding. And understanding, once it settles in, is very difficult to take back. The weeks leading up to the ceremony felt unreal, like time was moving forward, while something underneath it stayed completely still. My parents were energized in a way I hadn't seen before. They spoke about graduation, as if it were a personal milestone, a public validation of years they believed had been spent wisely. They planned everything with precision. Seating chart, arrival times, who would sit where and who would be introduced to whom. My mother coordinated outfits so we would look like a family in photos. My father printed copies of the program and read through it multiple times, tracing Emily's name with his finger as if it were proof of ownership. "This is our moment too," he said once, not defensively but as a statement of fact. Emily didn't argue. She didn't correct him. She listened, nodded, agreed. On the surface, she was exactly what they wanted her to be: grateful, composed, compliant. But I noticed how she carried herself differently, straighter, quieter, as if she were conserving energy instead of spending it. She stayed late on campus most nights, telling my parents she was studying or finishing projects. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. When she came home, she brought her laptop and a folder she never left unattended. She was careful with it, deliberate. It stayed close to her at all times. One evening, while my parents were out, she invited me over. We sat at the dining table, the same one where so many unspoken expectations had been laid out over the years. She opened the folder and slid documents toward me. "I want you to read this," she said. They were copies of the agreements she'd signed as a freshman. Trust management paperwork, tuition disbursement conditions, clauses outlining responsibilities hers and theirs. On the surface, it looked like financial organization. But reading more closely, the language told a different story. "They framed it as protection," she said. "But there are limits, conditions, things they can't actually enforce the way they think they can." I looked up at her. "Do they know that you know this?" "No," she said. "They think I never read past the first page." That assumption that she was too young, too dependent, too grateful to question was the same one they had made about me years ago. The difference was that Emily had the documentation to challenge it. "They've been threatening consequences they don't legally control," she continued. "And they've been doing it in writing." I felt a chill run through me. "Emily," I said carefully, "once you make this public, there's no going back." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm not acting out of anger." She told me she'd spoken with someone from the university. Not to complain, just to ask questions. Neutral questions about student rights, about public remarks during ceremonies, about what was and wasn't allowed. She had been careful not to frame it as conflict. "They assume students will follow the script," she said. "But there's no rule that says I can't speak honestly." I asked her why she didn't confront our parents privately. Why not settle it behind closed doors? She was quiet for a long moment. "Because they would never admit the truth if no one else could hear it," she said. "They'd rewrite it, like they always do." That answer stayed with me. At home, my parents were becoming more performative by the day. They practiced what they would say to relatives, how they would describe their sacrifices. They talked about how proud they were that Emily understood what they had done for her. "She knows we did this out of love," my mother said one night, smiling. "She's very appreciative." Emily smiled back. She even thanked them. I watched my parents relax, reassured by the familiarity of her compliance. They believed the tension of the past few years had resolved itself quietly the way they preferred. But there was a difference between peace and pause. The night before the ceremony, Emily couldn't sleep. She came into my room just after midnight, sitting on the edge of the bed like she used to when we were younger. "I keep thinking about how they'll react," she said. "Not what they'll say, what they'll feel." "They'll feel exposed," I said. "People rarely handle that well." She nodded. "I'm not trying to humiliate them." "I know," I said. "But truth does that sometimes." She took a deep breath. "I'm scared," she admitted. "But I'm more scared of graduating and realizing I never actually lived my own life." I didn't have a comforting answer. I just reached for her hand and held it. That was enough. The morning of the ceremony arrived bright and clear, the kind of day people associate with new beginnings. My parents were in high spirits, dressed impeccably, moving with the confidence of people who believed everything was under control. They spoke loudly, laughed easily, posed for photos before we even left the house. Emily was calm, not numb, not distant, just calm. At the venue, the crowd buzzed with excitement. Families gathered, cameras, ready programs, folded neatly in their hands. My parents took their seats in the front row exactly where they had planned. They looked around proudly, greeting acquaintances, basking in admiration. I took a seat a few rows back, close enough to see everything clearly, far enough to watch without being seen. As the ceremony began, my parents leaned forward attentive. Every time Emily's department was mentioned, they squeezed each other's hands. They whispered about how worth it everything had been. Emily waited patiently with the other graduates, her expression composed. She checked the folder one last time, then closed it and set it beside her. When her name was finally called, my parents stood immediately clapping before anyone else could. The applause filled the room. And for a moment, everything looked exactly the way my parents had imagined it would. What they didn't realize was that they were about to hear a version of the story they had never prepared for. One that didn't deny their contribution but refused to let it define the ending. Emily stepped forward, steady and unhurried, carrying with her, not anger, not resentment, but something far more unsettling to people who rely on control. Clarity. From my seat, I could see the way Emily held herself as she walked toward the podium. It wasn't dramatic. There was no hesitation, no visible nerves. If anything, she looked grounded, as if she'd already made peace with whatever came next. My parents, however, leaned forward in their seats, faces lit with anticipation. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the visible return on years of investment. The ceremony followed its usual rhythm. Names were called, degrees were handed over. Applause rose and fell in predictable waves. When Emily's turn came, the announcer paused slightly longer than usual, emphasizing her achievements. My father straightened his jacket. My mother clasped her hands together, already smiling. Emily accepted her diploma, posed briefly for the official photo, and then did something unexpected. She didn't step away. Instead, she turned back toward the microphone. There was a small ripple of confusion among the organizers, a subtle shift in the room. This wasn't part of the schedule. I felt my chest tighten, not with fear but with recognition. This was the moment she had been preparing for. She cleared her throat once calmly. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady, carrying easily through the hall. "I know today is meant to be about celebration, and I want to honor that. But I also believe milestones matter because they tell the truth about how we got here." My parents' smiles faltered just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice. But I did. Emily continued thanking professors, mentors, classmates. Her words were respectful, thoughtful. The audience relaxed again, reassured. This was normal. This was safe. Then she shifted. "I also want to speak about support," she said. "Because support can mean different things depending on how it's given." A quiet settled over the room. Not silence exactly, but attention. She acknowledged our parents by name, thanking them for contributing financially to her education. My mother nodded proudly. My father's shoulders relaxed. This was what they had wanted to hear. But I've learned, Emily went on, that money is not the same as autonomy, and generosity is not the same as ownership. I felt a collective inhale ripple through the crowd. My parents froze. Emily didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She spoke the way someone speaks when they've already decided not to be misunderstood. "When I was 18, I signed documents related to my tuition," she said. "At the time, I was told they were standard. I trusted that explanation." My father shifted in his seat. My mother's smile disappeared entirely. Over the last few years, Emily continued, those documents have been referenced repeatedly, not as financial records but as leverage, as reminders that my choices were conditional. There it was. The truth stated plainly. A murmur spread through the audience. People glanced at one another, unsure how to react. This wasn't anger. It wasn't drama. It was something far more unsettling, clarity delivered without apology. Emily reached into her folder and held up a single page. "I reviewed what I signed," she said, "and I asked questions. I learned what those agreements do and do not allow." At that moment, one of the university officials stepped closer, clearly alert now. Emily acknowledged them with a brief nod before continuing. "They do not grant control over my career choices," she said. "They do not dictate where I live, who I work for, or what I owe emotionally. They outline payments, nothing more." My parents tried to stand. An usher gently but firmly gestured for them to remain seated. The movement drew more attention than any raised voice could have. Emily's words kept coming, measured and precise. "I am grateful for financial assistance. But gratitude does not erase consent, and it does not turn support into authority." The room was completely silent now. I watched my parents' faces change in real time, confusion giving way to disbelief, disbelief hardening into something like panic. This wasn't a private conversation they could reframe later. This was public, permanent. Emily finished by thanking the audience for listening and expressing hope that families would talk more openly about the difference between helping and controlling. She didn't demand applause. She didn't ask for validation. She simply stepped back. For a moment, nothing happened. Then someone clapped. Then another. The applause spread slowly, unevenly, until it filled the room, not thunderous but deliberate. Respectful. The university official leaned into the microphone. "Thank you," they said carefully. "We appreciate students who engage thoughtfully with their experiences." That was all the confirmation Emily needed. My parents remained seated, faces, pale eyes fixed on the stage as if watching something they couldn't stop. Around them, relatives shifted uncomfortably. Whispers started questions without answers. I stayed where I was, heart pounding, watching the narrative my parents had spent years constructing unravel in real time. Not through confrontation, but through documentation. Not through anger, but through truth. After the ceremony resumed, everything felt altered. The names continued. The diplomas were handed out, but the atmosphere had changed. People were quieter, more reflective. My parents didn't clap again. When the ceremony ended, families gathered, hugging graduates, taking photos. My parents stood stiffly, unsure where to direct their energy now that their role had been publicly redefined. Emily approached them calmly. "We'll talk later," she said. It wasn't a request. They didn't respond. I joined her, standing slightly behind a witness rather than a participant. For the first time, I saw my parents without the armor of authority. They looked smaller, human, stripped of the assumption that money could insulate them from accountability. As we walked away together, Emily's hand brushed mine. She didn't look back. I realized then that justice doesn't always come with punishment. Sometimes it comes with exposure. With the simple act of saying what was true in a place where it can't be ignored. And sometimes the most powerful intervention isn't force or rebellion, but preparation, meeting the right moment. The moments after the ceremony blurred together, but one feeling stayed sharp and unmistakable: disorientation. Not just mine, but everyone's. It was the kind that settles in when a familiar story suddenly collapses, and no one knows which parts were real anymore. My parents stood apart from the other families, their earlier confidence gone. They didn't approach Emily. They didn't approach me. They whispered urgently to each other, voices low, glancing around as if searching for someone who could undo what had just happened. But there was no one like that here. No authority higher than the truth that had already been spoken. Emily moved through the crowd, calmly accepting congratulations, thanking professors, hugging friends. To anyone who hadn't heard her speech closely, she looked like any other graduate, relieved, proud, composed. But those who had listened watched her differently. There was a new respect in their eyes. Not pity, not curiosity, recognition. An aunt finally approached my parents. "That was unexpected," she said carefully. My mother forced a smile. "She's been under a lot of stress," she replied. "College does that to kids." Kids! Emily was 22. The explanation didn't land the way my mother expected. The aunt nodded politely, then excused herself. That pattern repeated itself. Each attempt to minimize what had happened fell flat. The words were too careful now, too obviously constructed. The audience had shifted. Emily didn't confront my parents immediately. She knew better. Exposure had already done the work. Any argument now would only give them something to push against. Instead, she focused on the people who mattered, those who had supported her without conditions. I stayed close, watching, absorbing everything. For years, I had lived in the shadow of my parents' certainty. Seeing it cracked felt unreal, like watching a wall crumble that I hadn't realized was load-bearing. Eventually, my parents found me. "What was that?" my father demanded, keeping his voice low but sharp. "Did you know about this?" I met his gaze steadily. "I knew she was asking questions," I said. I didn't know exactly what she'd say. "That was inappropriate," my mother added quickly. "That wasn't the place." "She spoke the truth," I replied. Their faces hardened. "You're taking her side," my father said. "I'm acknowledging reality," I said. "There's a difference." They didn't have a response for that. They were used to authority, to compliance, to conversations that ended when they decided they should. This one didn't. Eventually, they walked away, not in anger exactly, but confusion. Power slipping away often looks like that at first. Later that evening, Emily and I sat together outside the venue, the sun sinking low behind the buildings. The folder rested beside her untouched now. Its purpose had been served. "You okay?" I asked. She nodded. "Relieved," she said, "and tired." "You were clear," I said. "That mattered." She looked at me, eyes steady. "I learned that from you," she said. "From watching you survive quietly." I didn't know how to respond to that. For years, I had seen my silence as a flaw. Hearing it reframed as something that had taught her patience, observation, restraint, it shifted something inside me. That night, my parents didn't call. They didn't text. The silence felt heavy but different from before. It wasn't punishment. It was uncertainty. The next morning, my father left a voicemail for Emily. His tone was controlled, formal. He said they needed to talk privately. He said what she had done was hurtful and unnecessary. He said they deserved respect. Emily listened once, then saved it. "They're going to try to reframe it," she said to me later. "Make it about manners instead of control." "They always do," I said. She met with them a few days later in a neutral place. I didn't attend. That conversation belonged to her. When she came back, her expression was calm but resolute. "They wanted an apology," she said. "Not for misunderstanding, just for speaking publicly." And I asked. I said no, she replied. I offered honesty instead. She told me they denied intending control, that they insisted everything they'd done was out of love, that they blamed miscommunication, stress, generational differences. She didn't argue. She didn't need to. The documents spoke for themselves. "They can't undo what people heard," she said. "And they can't unknow what I know now." Over the following weeks, the consequences settled in. Not dramatically, quietly. Invitations slowed. Conversations became careful. My parents' narrative no longer went unchallenged, and without it they seemed unsure how to position themselves. Emily moved forward. She accepted the internship she wanted. She made plans without asking for permission. She returned calls on her own schedule. The leverage my parents had relied on was gone, not because she took it from them, but because it no longer worked. Watching her, I felt something loosen inside me, too. For years, I had believed that enduring quietly was the only way to survive our family dynamics. Emily had shown me another option, not confrontation, not rebellion, but clarity paired with timing. My parents still struggled with the shift. They tried to regain footing through guilt, through reminders of sacrifice. But the effect was dulled. Once a pattern is seen clearly, it loses its power. One evening my mother said to me, "We just wanted the best for her." "I believe that," I said. "But wanting the best doesn't mean deciding everything." She didn't respond. Some lessons take longer to settle. As for me, I realized that standing upright doesn't always mean standing loudly. Sometimes it means staying steady when the ground shifts. Sometimes it means refusing to participate in a story that no longer fits. Emily didn't win by arguing. She won by preparing, by understanding the system that had been used to contain her, and by choosing the moment when truth would matter most. And in doing so, she changed more than just her own future. She changed the balance. The days after the ceremony unfolded with a strange quiet, the kind that follows an earthquake no one wants to acknowledge. On the surface, life went on. People went back to work. Emily packed up her dorm room. Emails about internships and onboarding schedules arrived. But beneath all of it, something fundamental had shifted and everyone involved could feel it. My parents tried to regain control, the only way they knew how, by retreating into formality. Messages became short and carefully worded. Phone calls were replaced by texts. When they did speak, they focused on logistics, avoiding anything that touched the ceremony directly. It was as if ignoring the rupture might somehow seal it. Emily didn't chase them. That alone unsettled them more than any argument could have. One afternoon, she received an email from my father titled simply "Next Steps." The message was long, structured like a business proposal. He outlined what he believed should happen now, where Emily should live, how often they should communicate, what kind of job she should prioritize. At the end, he reminded her of everything we've done, and expressed disappointment that she had chosen to handle things publicly. Emily forwarded the email to me without comment. "They still think this is a negotiation," I said after reading it. "They think they still have leverage," she replied. What my parents didn't realize was that the ceremony hadn't just shifted perception externally, it had changed the internal dynamics too. Emily no longer felt the need to justify herself. She responded to my father's email politely but briefly acknowledging receipt and stating that she would be making her own decisions going forward. No explanations, no apologies. The reply came quickly. "You're being ungrateful," my mother wrote. "After everything we sacrificed, this is how you repay us." There it was, the old script. Emily didn't respond immediately. She let the message sit. That pause was intentional. She was done reacting. When she did reply, she chose her words carefully. She thanked them for their financial support. She reiterated that gratitude did not equate to control. She stated clearly once that future communication would need to respect her autonomy. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't defensive. It was final. The reaction was predictable. My parents oscillated between guilt and anger, between hurt and indignation. They called relatives. They told their version of the story. Some people believed them, some didn't. But what mattered was that the version they told no longer went uncontested. I started getting calls too. "She embarrassed them," one relative said cautiously. "She told the truth," I replied. "Well, some things should stay private. Control thrives in private," I said before I could stop myself. That conversation ended quickly. What surprised me most was how little Emily seemed shaken by the backlash. She was thoughtful about it, but not consumed. The weight she had carried for years had been replaced by something lighter, not ease exactly, but alignment. Her actions finally matched her understanding. She focused on her transition instead. She moved into a small apartment near her internship, paid for with her own savings and a modest salary. The place was simple, but it was hers. No conditions, no expectations attached. I helped her unpack. As we stacked boxes and assembled furniture, I thought about how different this moment felt from my own early independence. I had been driven by necessity. Emily was driven by choice. One evening, as we sat on the floor eating takeout, she said, "I keep waiting to feel guilty." And I asked. "It hasn't come," she said, "not the way I thought it would." "That's because guilt only works when you believe you've done something wrong," I said. She smiled faintly. "I think I finally understand that." My parents struggled with this new reality. Without access to Emily's daily life, they seemed unsure how to assert relevance. They tried offering advice, then criticism, then silence. None of it landed the way it used to. Eventually, they requested a family meeting. Neutral location, clear agenda. They wanted to clear the air. Emily agreed on her terms. The meeting was tense, but contained. My parents spoke first, framing their actions as love misunderstood. They emphasized intention over impact. They asked for recognition, for reassurance that they were still respected. Emily listened without interrupting. When it was her turn, she didn't accuse. She didn't list grievances. She spoke about boundaries, about the difference between help and control, about how fear of losing support had shaped her silence. "I'm not cutting you out," she said calmly, "but I'm not giving up my agency to keep you comfortable." The room went quiet. My parents didn't agree. Not fully, but something had changed. The certainty they once carried was gone. They were negotiating now, not from power, but from adjustment. Afterward, my mother pulled me aside. "You could have told us," she said. "You saw this coming." "I did," I replied. "I just didn't think you were ready to hear it." She didn't argue. She looked tired. Driving home, I thought about how often families confuse longevity with righteousness, how years of sacrifice can become justification for control if no one questions the terms. Emily had questioned them, publicly, carefully, and that had made all the difference. Justice didn't arrive with a verdict or a punishment. There was no judge, no gavel, no dramatic fallout. It arrived as a recalibration, slow, uncomfortable, undeniable. Emily didn't win by taking something from my parents. She won by refusing to give up what was never theirs to claim. And in watching her do that, I realized something else. Silence isn't always submission. Sometimes it's preparation. The shift didn't happen all at once. It settled in gradually like dust after a door slammed slow enough that you could almost pretend nothing had changed, but impossible to ignore once it did. My parents were still adjusting to the fact that their authority no longer worked the way it used to. Emily, on the other hand, moved forward with a quiet confidence that felt unfamiliar and steady at the same time. About a month after the ceremony, my parents made one last attempt to regain footing. They requested a formal meeting this time, with a family attorney present. The phrasing was deliberate, official. They wanted structure. They wanted a witness. And I suspected they wanted to reassert control by bringing in someone they believed would validate their position. Emily agreed to attend again on her terms. She asked me to come as well, not to speak but to observe. I want someone there who remembers how things actually happened, she said. The meeting was held in a small conference room at a downtown law office. Neutral territory, fluorescent lights, a long table that made everyone feel exposed. My parents arrived early, dressed as if for court. My mother carried a folder of her own. My father sat upright, hands folded, expression composed. They expected this setting to favor them. The attorney, a calm, middle-aged man with a practiced neutrality, opened the meeting by asking what the purpose was. My father spoke first. He outlined their financial contributions, their intentions, their belief that Emily had misunderstood their role. He framed the ceremony as an emotional misstep, a breach of family trust. "We simply want clarity," he said. "An acknowledgement." Emily listened without interruption. When it was her turn, she slid her folder across the table. "I want clarity too," she said. "That's why I'm here." The attorney reviewed the documents carefully. Page by page, he asked questions, precise, unemotional ones. About timelines, about language used, about expectations that were communicated outside the written agreements. My parents grew restless as the conversation moved away from feelings and toward facts. Finally, the attorney leaned back slightly. "Based on what I'm seeing," he said, "the agreements are limited in scope. They concern payment management, not behavioral control." My father frowned. "But we were clear about our expectations," he said. "I'm sure you were," the attorney replied. "But expectations are not enforceable unless they're contractual." My mother interjected. "So you're saying we have no say?" "After everything I'm saying," the attorney said evenly, "that financial support does not grant authority over adult decisions unless explicitly stated. And in this case, it isn't." The room went quiet. This was the moment my parents had been trying to avoid. Not confrontation, but confirmation. Not from family, but from someone they couldn't dismiss as emotional or biased. Emily didn't gloat. She didn't speak at all. She let the silence do its work. The attorney continued, "If there's ongoing tension, I'd recommend clear boundaries moving forward, for everyone's sake." When the meeting ended, my parents left quickly. They didn't argue. They didn't raise their voices. They were subdued in a way I hadn't seen before. Authority, once challenged by facts, has a way of shrinking. Outside, Emily exhaled slowly. "That was the last thing they had," she said. "What do you mean?" I asked. "They needed someone else to tell them they were right," she replied. "Now they can't." In the weeks that followed, the dynamic changed decisively. My parents stopped referencing money altogether, not because they had suddenly understood the harm, but because the tool no longer worked. Without leverage, there was nothing to reinforce the narrative they'd relied on for years. Emily's independence solidified. She settled into her job, built routines that didn't revolve around family approval, and learned what it felt like to make decisions without bracing for consequences that weren't hers to carry. She still spoke to our parents, but the conversations were different, shorter, more respectful, less invasive. As for me, I felt something unexpected: relief. Not because everything was resolved perfectly, but because the imbalance that had shaped my entire family life had finally been named. And once named, it lost its power over me too. One evening, my father called me alone. "You think we were wrong," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I think you confused help with control," I replied. He was quiet for a long moment. "We did what we thought was best." "I believe that," I said. "But impact matters more than intention." He didn't argue. He didn't apologize either. Growth doesn't always arrive fully formed. Emily later told me she didn't expect reconciliation to look like warmth or understanding. "I just wanted it to look like honesty," she said. "Anything else is a bonus." Watching her, I realized how different our endings were. I had escaped control by leaving early and saying nothing. She had dismantled it by staying long enough to understand it, and then refusing to play along. Justice in the end wasn't loud. It wasn't vengeful. It was a series of quiet confirmations, each one removing a layer of illusion until only truth remained. And truth, once spoken and verified, has a way of standing on its own. Time did what it always does after conflict. It revealed what was real and what had only been held together by pressure. In the months following the meeting with the attorney, our family settled into a new rhythm. It wasn't comfortable, and it wasn't close in the way people like to imagine reconciliation should be. But it was honest, and that made it sustainable. My parents stopped offering unsolicited advice, not entirely at first, but noticeably. When they did slip, the comments were softer, less certain. The confidence that had once framed every sentence was gone. Without financial leverage, they had to rely on something else: mutual respect, or at least the appearance of it. Emily noticed the difference immediately. "They're thinking before they speak now," she told me. "They never used to." That alone was a kind of victory. She continued to build her life on her own terms. Her job turned into a full-time position, her days filled with challenges that were demanding but hers to navigate. She made mistakes, learned from them, adjusted. No one kept score, no one reminded her of what she owed. Watching her, I realized how much of our childhood had been shaped by unspoken hierarchies. Love given more loudly to one child. Expectations weighted unevenly. For years I had assumed that imbalance was permanent. Emily had proven it wasn't. The distance between her and our parents remained, but it was no longer hostile. It was defined. Boundaries once established tend to clarify things quickly. Conversations stayed on neutral ground. Holidays were shorter. Fewer expectations meant fewer disappointments. One afternoon, my mother asked me quietly, "Do you think she'll ever forgive us?" I thought about it before answering. "I think forgiveness isn't the same as returning to how things were," I said. "Sometimes it just means moving forward without resentment." She nodded slowly as if absorbing something new. For me, the change was internal as much as external. I stopped minimizing my own experience. I stopped explaining away the neglect I'd grown up with as independence. I allowed myself to see it clearly, not with bitterness but with honesty. Emily and I grew closer in a way we hadn't been before. Not because we shared trauma, but because we shared understanding. She asked me once if I regretted not speaking up sooner. "No," I said. "I think I did what I needed to survive. You did what you needed to change things." Both were true. The story our family had told for years that sacrifice justified control, that money equaled authority, no longer held. It couldn't. Too many people had heard the truth. Too many facts had been laid out calmly, publicly, and without apology. My parents didn't lose everything. They didn't face public humiliation beyond what they brought on themselves. What they lost was something subtler but more significant, the ability to define reality without challenge. And that loss reshaped them. There were moments of discomfort, awkward dinners, conversations that ended too soon. But there were also moments of quiet progress. My father asking Emily about her work without advising. My mother listening instead of correcting. Small things but meaningful. I realized then that justice doesn't always mean punishment. Sometimes it means balance being restored, power redistributed, voices heard that were previously ignored. Emily never sought revenge. She didn't need to. The truth had done the work for her. She stood upright not because she defeated someone, but because she refused to stay bent. As for me, I found my own voice changing too. I spoke more directly. I took up space without apology. I no longer felt obligated to soften my presence to keep peace that had never been equal. The ceremony had been a turning point, but the real transformation happened afterward, in the slow, quiet days where new patterns replaced old ones. Our family wasn't perfect. It never had been. But it was finally real. The first time I truly understood that everything had changed was almost ordinary. There was no argument, no announcement, no emotional confrontation. Just a small moment that would have gone unnoticed before, except it didn't. My parents invited Emily and me to dinner. Not a holiday, not a celebration, just dinner. There was no agenda sent ahead of time. No reminders about timing or expectations. When we arrived, my mother didn't comment on what Emily was wearing or ask about her savings. My father didn't ask about her job plans beyond "how's work been." It was subtle, but it was real. We sat at the same table, where years earlier money had hovered like an invisible authority. Now it was absent, not mentioned, not implied. The conversation stayed on neutral ground, work, weather, a neighbor's new dog. It wasn't warm exactly, but it wasn't tense either. At one point, my mother asked Emily, "Are you happy?" The question hung in the air. Emily paused, considering. "I'm getting there," she said honestly. My mother nodded. She didn't push. She didn't follow up with advice. That alone told me more than any apology could have. Later that night, as Emily and I drove back, she said, "That would have been impossible a year ago." She was right. My parents hadn't transformed into different people. They still believed they had done the right thing. They still struggled with letting go. But the difference was this: they no longer believed they were untouchable. The illusion of unquestioned authority was gone, and once that illusion breaks, it can't be rebuilt the same way. Emily's life continued to expand. She signed her own lease renewal without consulting anyone. She negotiated a raise on her own. She made choices, some good, some imperfect, and owned all of them. No one reminded her of past sacrifices. No one framed her decisions as debts being repaid. I watched her grow into herself, not dramatically but steadily. And in doing so, she changed how I saw myself too. For a long time, I believed my role in the family had been to endure quietly, to absorb imbalance and call it maturity, to accept less and tell myself I didn't need more. Emily's courage forced me to reevaluate that story. Silence, I realized, isn't virtue on its own. It's only powerful when it's chosen. Mine hadn't been. It had been learned. And yet I didn't resent it anymore. It had taught me patience, awareness, and restraint tools Emily later used with precision. In that way, my endurance had meaning too. One afternoon, my father called me unexpectedly. "I've been thinking," he said, "about how different you and your sister are." I waited. "You always handled things on your own," he continued. "Maybe we assumed that meant you didn't need us as much." The admission was imperfect, incomplete, but it was closer to acknowledgement than I'd ever heard. "I needed you," I said calmly. "Just not in the way you measured." He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply said, "I see that now." That was enough. Emily never demanded apologies. She never needed public redemption. The justice she sought wasn't emotional, it was structural. She wanted the rules clarified, the power imbalance corrected, the narrative reset, and she got exactly that. What happened at the ceremony wasn't an act of rebellion, it was an act of alignment. She brought her internal understanding into the open in a space where denial couldn't survive. That's why it worked. The most powerful thing she did wasn't speaking, it was preparing, reading, asking questions, waiting, choosing the moment when truth would carry the most weight. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't shame anyone. She simply refused to stay silent when silence would have preserved a lie. In the end, no one was destroyed. But something was dismantled, the idea that generosity excuses control, that sacrifice buys obedience, that gratitude cancels autonomy. Our family learned slowly and uncomfortably that love without boundaries can become something else entirely. And I learned this: the people who are underestimated often carry the clearest vision. The ones who endure quietly are usually watching closely. And when they finally stand upright, they don't need to push anyone down to do it. If this story made you pause, I invite you to reflect. Where in your life have you confused gratitude with obligation? Where have you stayed silent to keep a peace that wasn't equal? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe that quiet strength deserves to be heard, consider subscribing. Some stories don't end with applause, they end with balance.